Welcome to the Four Seasons Podcast, brought to you by B&H Wealth Strategies, serving Northeast Tennessee and Southwest Virginia since 1966. Here, we guide you through the ever-changing seasons of your financial journey, offering insights to help you grow, protect, and enjoy your wealth. Ready to turn your financial dreams into reality? Dare to dream. And now, here's your host, President of B&H Wealth Strategies, Jeff Bingham.
When headlines shake the markets, smart investors look beyond noise and focus on what they can control. Welcome back, everybody. Skip Monty here, back in the studio with the star of our Four Seasons podcast, President of B&H Wealth Strategies, Jeff Bingham. Jeff, how's it going?
It's good. I don't know that I've ever been called a star,
Well, hey.
in a positive way anyway. I mean, I might have been accused of trying to become a star at times. Sounds like an old Coach Buck Van Hust thing. You want to be a star, you get stars in your eyes. That's what he used to say to some of us basketball players when he thought we were shooting too much and not playing team ball. He would come in at halftime and tell us we had stars in our eyes. You know, your headline hunter. So yeah, I appreciate it. I feel better about the one you gave me just now than those memories right there.
Sorry about that. Well, I meant it only in a positive way because you are the star of the Four Seasons podcast, and
No, I
so got to call it the way it is, right?
No, and I appreciate that. And for the Coach Buck Van Hust reference, for those that are listening and watch the podcast that have been in the Kingsport Tri-Cities area, they might appreciate that. I'm sure a lot of our younger listeners, and maybe yourself included, would have no idea who I was talking about, other than obviously the Dobbins Bennett Dome is called the Buck Van Hust Dome. So maybe there's your reference point. I guess really one of the more, he was really a revered basketball coach. At one time, the winningest coach in the United States, I believe.
Yep,
I think
I
that's
believe
been
that's
surpassed now, but yeah. So
if they don't know the
yeah,
reference, they
Buck
should.
was a legend.
That's right.
Yeah,
Truly,
exactly.
truly a legend. Well, Jeff, in one of our last episodes, we talked about market instability and the global market and how that affects investors' decisions. And we it's just a lot to cover in that. So why don't we pick up where we left off? What should investors be thinking of or about when global instability impacts the market?
You sure you don't want to just go back and talk about Coach Van Hust?
Actually, I would, but up to you.
No, no, no. Glad to talk about it. And I think as we were kind of talking off air, and I started thinking about what the topic was, and we were going to cover this again. Is that I think again, and I may have pointed this out in the last podcast, is that when we think global instability, I think we automatically think of conflict, of, war, kind of bullets and bombs, if you will, or at least the threat thereof. And that's certainly a large part of it. And we certainly have those, we still have that going on, in the world. And we also have the threat of that going on in the world. So I'm not trying to, kind of play that off as if it's not that big a deal. But I mean, I guess we're, God, is that right? The Ukraine, Russia conflict war that's going on will, I guess, in February, correct me if I'm wrong, but will be, it's 2022, right? So it'll be 4 years that war has drug on, and, since it started, and we can kind of talk about all that, but when you think about that and you think about how the markets have done, since that point in time, I mean, 2022 was a difficult year. Oil prices, inflation, various things were going up at that point in time. So that, when we think of, I think when we think of global conflict, we look at that and you can point at a year like 2022, we can say, well, that's the reason why the markets, both the U.S. and the global markets sold off. And that's a pretty typical, way to think about that. And there's a lot of truth in that in 2022. But the inflationary pressures didn't just come on, which is why the market sold off, or one of the main reasons why the market sold off in 2022 would have been inflationary pressure and interest rates going up. And that would have occurred whether Russia and Ukraine had gone to war or not, whether that conflict had started at that point in time. It certainly had an impact, negative impact, or drove oil prices up, almost immediately, because much of Western Europe and the world, for that matter, much of the world, relies on, Russian oil and Russian natural gas. And so, when that happens right there and there's a war going on, there's those kind of prices are going to drive up, adding to the inflationary pressures, obviously, that were present and coming into full view in 2022. So, that's kind of the typical way to kind of think about it. War, and then obviously we've had Israel and Gaza that's been going on, and that um, is kind of at least ameliorated for right now. We'll see how that continues to kind of whether that ceasefire, or you want to kind of phrase that, whether that can kind of hold, and then kind of be sorted out as we move forward, and kind of the rebuilding a little bit in Gaza and what that's going to look like, and that's for another day and another conversation, I suppose. But I think the other things that I think that we think that where global instability takes place is that, I just look at this week, and this is kind of date when this was, I guess it was maybe Wednesday, when the Saudi prince was at the White House visiting with Trump, and that meeting there with Saudi Arabia, and that, a very, and I was talking with a couple of people about this. It's a very interesting relationship. I mean, obviously with the Saudis, in the United States government. I mean, it is, um, been tenuous at best over times. And is it how palatable is it for Americans to watch, the two countries, be cozy, but is it necessary, and those kind of things. But and I guess where I'm going with that is that the global instability that looks like it in that regard is that, Saudi Arabia has been, right, wrong, or indifferent, what you think about them and their in the country, is they've kind of been the glue, they are the central force in the Middle East. And as Saudi kind of dictates much, not exactly this, but pretty much the Middle East will fall in line as the Saudis kind of put their foot down, let's say, and their edicts and whatnot. So, I think that is important to have that, but also the Saudis or, you watched over probably the last 5 years, maybe the last decade, as oil, they're not the dominant, or at least as they were. OPEC is not as dominant, so therefore the Saudis are not as dominant in the oil space as they once were. I mean, they drove everything, but now the United States, is in production, and so there's a different thing. And now oil prices are around $60 a barrel. 80% of Saudi Arabia's revenue, right? Their revenue streams comes from oil, I think, and I think I'm right on that number, give or take roughly 80% of the country's revenue. And they have been rich beyond measure for years and years. But now at $60 a barrel, if you watch over the last several years, and last year in particular, the Saudis had to actually what they brought in revenue versus and they've got a lot of spending projects going on because they're trying to kind of diversify away from just oil as we're all wind through this. They had to borrow money, right? They didn't bring in as much revenue. And this is not a country that has, a lot of debt. I mean, they've got, I don't know, I won't be right on the number. I mean, they may have two or $300 billion worth of total debt, but they borrowed some $23 billion last year, and that's in a country their size and oil revenue. That's not their debt ratios aren't problematic, but now you're watching them have to borrow money, go out to the outside world, whether through bonds or private investment, various things to bring in money. And that's a curiosity to see. And they've promised a 600 billion to $1 trillion, project in the United States. And that's kind of what the meeting was about, at least on surface right there. But the Saudis are looking for other ways. And when the Saudis, I guess my point is that that's a point of global instability. When Saudi Arabia, which is kind of the glue of the Middle East, I would argue, from the Muslim countries that are there, with Israel sitting in the middle of that, as they kind of dictate, that's kind of how it's either going to be turmoil or kind of peace or that kind of thing. And so when they have a little bit of financial pressure and oil prices driving down, they want oil prices at about $80 a barrel, we want, right? As a country, we want them at $60, but as low as we can get them. That's what, and arguably, I mean, that may or may not be exactly true with oil producers, but I think at least on surface in Washington, the administration, politicians as a whole, and as Americans, we want it as cheap as it can be. But when oil prices are as cheap, as it gets lower and lower, it puts a lot of strain because production, oil producers don't want to produce as much. But again, going back to the Saudis, they need it at a higher price. It's 80% of their, the country's revenue comes from that. So that's a big slash for them. And that's also why they're diversifying going in to try to, look at other revenue streams. They've gotten big into entertainment and sports and various things. So, you know, I think so. Again, the point of all that, it didn't really tell me where we want to invest in that, but I think that's those are points of global instability that I think are not as headline dominant as bullets and bombs, but those are the kind of things where global instability and the very sensitive nature of how a global economic landscape actually works. And that's just one point there. And I think, and I use that because this week, the Saudi prince was there, in the White House. And again, it's interesting thing to look at as we cozy up to them too. Is only 24 years ago, and the majority of the 9/11 terrorists, where did they come from? Where were they born? Where did they live? They were Saudi Arabians, right? I mean, it's a really delicate dance that that geopolitics requires from all points, and it's I guess in some ways it's something that it generally works pretty well, and maybe not paying too much of attention to it makes us sleep a little better at night. So anyway, I'll let you kind of come back in and fill on that. I hope that wasn't too long and a winding explanation of global instability.
No, well, actually, I mean, there's so much instability right now. There are so many things going on. No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I wanted to ask from a investor standpoint, like somebody like me or you, what practical steps can someone take today to strengthen their portfolio against future instability?
Again, I think, the geopolitics of the world that are going on out there, if you let your portfolio be dictated too much by that and try to change with the winds of change and how all that moves very fluidly and rapidly, you'll always be chasing that. So again, I go back to is you put together a portfolio that matches your goals and objectives, the where you are, where you want to be, and how you want to get there. How you want to get there is really where the design of a portfolio is going to come into play. Now, that doesn't mean that you can have, if oil prices are going down and inflation thus generally is receding some when you see that, having commodities and natural resources in your portfolio, which we do use those types of things in portfolios, may not be as attractive. So you might want to lighten up that. But if you see inflationary pressures there, and you see oil prices and other precious metals, these rare earth metals that we keep talking about, that are going to be, kind of the future of, battery powered cars and other alternative energy sources that are out there. These natural earths materials are necessary, and so you can invest in those kind of things. And so when those things are, scarce but in demand, and oil prices are going up, then you might want to have a heavier dose there. You can lean a portfolio based on that. And but I said, I was talking about natural resources a moment ago. Probably the best performing asset class that you could have in your portfolio this year at this moment in time is probably um, is gold. Gold has had a phenomenal year. I don't know, we're somewhere between probably 40 and 50% on a year over year basis on an increase in gold. Um, that's an interesting conversation to have. We can talk about, at some point in time, why is that? And as my dad would always say, that's because there's more buyers than there are sellers of it. That's why things go up, or down. There's either more buyers or sellers, or more sellers than buyers. So that's that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but I think a portfolio is put together, for the long term, you modify, you tweak it. You don't try to outsmart global geopolitical pressures that are out there, these crises in the world.
In other words, don't knee jerk.
Don't knee jerk,
Don't.
right? You don't want to, you don't always want to hear your advisor, which we all, a lot of us say, and you hear this all the time, is that, just stay the course. And if you stay the course, that it'll all work out. And there is a lot of truth in that. But staying the course doesn't mean that you are not making subtle adjustments to your portfolio based on, where growth versus value, as I talked about, natural resources, commodities, and those kind of things. You can own real estate in portfolios. I mean, there's ways to make adjustments, to tweak portfolios, but not make those knee-jerk reactions.
Very good. Well, Jeff, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your perspective on this. It's not an easy thing to do, to hold your ground and stay the course, but great advice, and I think that applies in a lot of different things, not just global instability. And would love to talk about gold in a future episode. You brought that up. I think that'd be a great discussion.
Absolutely, would love to.
All right,
We should do that for sure.
All right, sounds great. Until then, we hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Four Seasons Podcast.
Thanks for tuning into the Four Seasons Podcast, brought to you by B&H Wealth Strategies, where your financial success is our priority. Schedule your free 20-minute consultation today by calling 423-247-1152 or by visiting bhretire.com. Take the first step toward making your financial dreams come true. Until next time, remember, every season is the right season to plan for your future. Securities and registered investment advisory services offered through Silver Oak Securities, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. B&H Wealth Strategies and Silver Oak Securities, Inc. are not affiliated.